Hi, I'm sorry for that. This thing just went off the air. It wasn't me. It was the that was dropped by UStream. It does happen once in a while. But anyway, I'm back, and I was just about to show you a video, and just in case it was caused by the video I was going to show you, I'm going to show you another one, which is made also in the antiphonal style, and that's the way the poetry was originally done. It was done tribally. There was a leader or a shaman who would begin to praise the gods or the god, wherever it happened to be, and the tribe would echo him or do a kind of variation of an echo, just like Gladys Knight and the Pips. Gladys Knight says something, and the Pips kind of play on it, and they kind of give it back to her. Midnight train to Georgia, midnight train, Georgia. Not quite what she's saying, but they're kind of adding to it and they're moving, so that the African American tradition is just directly out of the type of poetry that was done by us at an early stage, by all cultures basically, since we all came out of Africa. That's undoubtedly what we did, and we can see kind of traces of it. The Greeks use antiphonal poetry in their classic plays, which were done long after they learned to read and write. It was the only proper way to do a spiritual play, was to have a chorus to comment on what the speaker was saying. Blah, blah, blah. I've been through that in the early stages. If you missed it, go back and you catch them. So let me give you the Hotel in Mexico, which is an interesting thing, also set in the same town in Alamo. So let's see if this goes through and we can. Sometimes in my dreams, I'm in a small Mexican town.
It's so small.
It's heaven.
How small is it?
I mean, it's in heaven.
This heaven of yours.
My father comes here every day
Every single day.
to see me.
Just me.
He loves looking at my statues.
Just me.
It's a long, long wait, he says,
Mine.
between visits.
Just me.
Everything is
Just me.
like shadows here. And then you come, he says, and I can see you and touch you,
Like shadows.
just like the statues.
The beautiful shadows.
He likes the statues.
The shadows in your eyes.
He knows they're the part of me that will join him here soon.
Those eyes.
Not the boy who caused him problems, but
Those eyes.
the man who grew up next to him and listened to him. I show him my name, which is his name, and
Your name.
he almost cries to see it.
Your name.
So solid after all these dreamy years of nothing,
Your name.
memories floating back and forth.
Your name.
He can't think of anything better than to have me here.
Your name
He knows I get lost in the shadows
is my name.
of the statues, and sometimes
I am.
I forget who I am,
I am.
but not really.
So forgetful at times.
It's some other self comes up, and
I can't even remember
my father likes that half.
my own name.
It's so different
Sometimes I wake up
and so real, he says. It's so real
and it's dark.
to see you
So dark.
in your statues.
So scary.
I can feel you.
No light.
I can feel you.
No light at all. Not one even. Not one. Not one even.
Anyway,
Even.
that's what happens in heaven.
It's not even anymore, is it now?
In a small hotel called Mexico, where
Look.
all of a sudden we're together again.
Don't you see it?
I can't believe it.
The window. It's you
I can't believe it.
on the other side of the window.
Sometimes in my dreams,
Sometimes in my dreams.
I'm in a small Mexican town.
It's so small.
It's heaven.
How small is it?
I mean, it's in heaven.
This heaven of yours.
My father comes here every day
Every single day.
to see me.
Just me.
He loves looking at my statues.
Just me.
It's a long, long wait, he says,
Mine.
between visits.
Just me.
Everything is
Just me.
like shadows here. And then you come, he says, and I can see you and touch you,
Like shadows.
just like the statues.
The beautiful shadows.
He likes the statues.
The shadows in your eyes.
He knows they're the part of me that will join him here soon.
So you have a pretty good idea. That kind of, you cycled around again. That was a little late. You're getting up today, I have to admit. Not in you're getting up. I went up for a long time, but I got absorbed in some other stuff I was doing. And about 2 minutes to 4, I realized that I was scheduled to go on the air, so I hadn't set up my little Twitter blog, so you can Twitter me if you're into that kind of stuff. I think that all depends on you. What I thought I would talk about today a little bit, once you get a little taste of that, you see, and how that was done, basically, I took some pictures of Jorge Alvarez's hotel, who's a sculptor and a poet and a cantante. He's a wonderfully talented artist, and in Alamos. And I knew I was going to get a poem out of it, the way I use the pictures as a trigger. And I just took one look at them when I got back, and I got George DeJong together and Scylla Liscombe, and lo and behold, that out that poem came was one take, and that was it. There's no overdubbing, no multiple tracks. It's just bingo, bingo, and it's either a hit or a miss. And that's the way it works in oral poetry, really. You can't erase and go back and find some other words, all that nonsense. Just get rid of it. What you really want to do is you want to find the muse and hope you can call her in, and then don't get wet pants and just stick with it, because it's a pretty... You have to kind of hang on the thread between consciousness and unconsciousness and just say what's coming to you, and off it comes. So that's the way it's done. It's called a no-brainer. You want to turn the brain off. Our modern conscious mind is not a very good one for making poetry. It always wants to examine what it's done and declare it good or bad, whatever it wants to do. You have to shut that baby down if you want to make good poetry. And that's why when we look at the great poetry that was made every day, it was made in this time because it came right from the heart and the soul, the very essence, from the unconscious, let's put it that way, with very little conscious interference at all. So that's hard for some people to believe, but they should start to think about what it was like to have a pre-literate consciousness, which was one that was imitative and artistic rather than logical and explaining, and didn't have any mind space to plot little futures for yourself. You just lived in the present, much as an animal did, but you could tell stories. Okay. What I thought I'd do today is I just want to go back over this situation. I explained last week that it's pretty clear. At least it was clear to Graves enough, so he got a book published on it. Although the book is hard to read, it's called White Goddess. Came out in the '60s, and you can hook that together with the works of Jung, Carl Jung. Some people call him Jung. You can do that too. It doesn't make any difference. He's dead now. He can't correct you. And also with the work of Julian Jaynes. His grave's here. He was a poet and a novelist, and he made that jump that the god that controlled pre-literate cultures was a mother goddess, and that she is essentially the muse. Became internalized eventually as the muse, even as we went into our later literate period. And this, of course, is Julian Jaynes, who made the startling statement that men heard voices all of the time in the pre-literate times, and that one of those voices was the voice of the muse, or most accurately the muses, as everything in pre-literate culture is multiple, it's many. I think that's important to kind of understand. This poem you see in back of me, which is being spoken, but I've turned that off, that portion. It's done antiphonal, done with two types of music, weaving in and out. There's many layers, and there's the audio-visual layer that goes on top of it. That is a multi-layered poem that you simply have to let it kind of fall down on you and rain, but it's exactly the type of poem that would have been made by tribal man, but there's only two of us speaking, and there are two instruments playing, and then there's another layer that goes on top that takes the place of the mask and the costume. You know, what you really can say is that poetry can exist in a multi-layered environment because it did it for thousands and thousands of years prior to the invention of the pen and writing around 2000 BC. You know, it's just that so little of that really found its way into our literate cultures that if we didn't have Homer and the knowledge that the early books of the Bible came right out of that same pre-literate period, they were oral traditions that were passed down and eventually kind of codified by the Hebrews into a form that is not rhythmic. It has its own rhythm, and that for some reason that in fact the Bible writers didn't want to continue the oral tradition such as the Greeks did in terms of the meter of Homer, and they invented their own meter, which is kind of parallel phrasing. They wanted to turn it into a prose. I don't think they trusted the poetry. They wanted to get it down so it was clear and to the point, and they did a good job on it. They just wanted to invent a new way of recording, I think. It doesn't have any Semitic meter to it or rhythm that any scholar can really recognize. You know, it's people don't really recognize that, but that's what the scholars tell us on that, and I think I have to believe them. They wanted that document to be a written document, and they didn't want it to have any hint or taste of the oral tradition that supplied most of the information for the early books. Be that as it may, I tried to explain last week, is that how do we get to the point that we have something called a muse, which poets even today sense as a energy. You can say that it's an energy, okay, whatever it is. It's a psychic energy. It comes, and it's what they call is that in fact the muse is the force or the energy responsible for the emergence of a poem into consciousness. A true poem is always unannounced, always comes unbidden. You can't control the muse, and you can just try to entice the muse, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Most likely your best poems come to you out of the blue and seize you, and out of you pours a story that is both rhythmic and metaphoric, meaning that the language, although it's talking about a subway in Japan, is not talking about a subway in Japan. It's talking about your unconscious. It's talking about trying to find your way through the labyrinth of the unconscious, which is just like being on a subway in Japan with no knowledge of Japanese. I've had that dream time and time again. And so what happens is, this is a very important to, in fact, really understand if you want to understand poetry and also to understand psychic events. If you can think of the unconscious, I like to kind of phrase it as the animal consciousness we left behind when our consciousness formed itself out of that, whatever that evolutionary process was. And what was left behind was the animal consciousness, some part of it, the feeling part of it, okay? It was very smart. It knew how to get food. It knew how to bite you. You know, it knew how to procreate. You know, it knew how to communicate with the other animals in the pack to bring something down very, very, very rapidly. You know, it knew all those things. It knew how to survive in cold. It knew where to go. It had a long memory. You know, it could do problem solving, but it wasn't. But it couldn't tell stories. It just lived in the present. It couldn't stop time. And that's what happened when we got our human consciousness, when it broke away from that and formed itself very kind of tenuously. Whatever it was, 100, 200,000 years ago, nobody really knows, because they're just looking at little bones, you know. You really have to get to the point where that little monkey thing that we say is not a monkey anymore started to tell stories. And that is one of the things that is echoed in this myth that is going on in back of me, is that we became human when we began to tell stories. So what is that force? What is that energy that will suddenly seize poets who, Janes says, I showed you his picture, Julian Janes made a breakthrough in the 60s and declared that when Achilles says he heard Athena and she appeared in front of him and spoke to him and said, don't do that, he wasn't just making it up. That's what he was experiencing. He was experiencing voices and sometimes visualizations. You know, sometimes it'd be like a mist. They went into a kind of mist or a fog, whatever you want to call it. And what would happen is that he would hear the gods and he would obey the gods because the gods had wisdom. And he had learned, as all humans in early stages had learned, that the unconscious, which it didn't know that, it just thought of it as the gods, these voices were commanding, not in a rough, authoritative way, do it. When you heard the voice, your whole body rang that it was the truth. Anybody who's heard psychic voices know what I'm talking about. They're not hallucinations. They're clear as a bell. And you immediately understand them to be the truth and that you should act on them. That's the way they are. They're not all kinds of nonsense, blah, 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 like that. That's complete. That's the movies, We've got to get hip on this. Everybody has to start to be a little smarter about this, that the pre-literate peoples weren't dumbos. They gave us some incredible art, and they gave us Homer. And God knows how many other Homers that haven't survived in all the other cultures. The Greeks were so crazy about Homer, and he was so close to the literate age that somehow we were able to bring him over. And that's true about the early books of the Bible, too, although they weren't brought over as faithfully. But anyway, the important thing, if you think of the unconscious or the muse, the creative unconscious, the unconscious is so monumentally huge and has so many depths to it, as Jung began to point out to us. It's not just a drainage sump where all of our sexual desires go. That's the least of it. It seems to go beyond the individual in terms of what it knows. There seems to be a cultural or a racial or even a human memory that we all share, which makes sense if we came from one mother, wouldn't it? Somewhere down the long chain, it's all there. It's all coded in some little genome or something, and on the right circumstances, it'll rise up, as any prophet will tell you. If we have any prophets left today. But something like that happened to me in a minor way when the poem, which I call The Witness's Log, rose up inside me about 20 years ago. I didn't know where it came from. I didn't understand half of it, but I knew it was correct. And what it had come from the long chain of the collective unconscious had just chosen to rise up, and it took me as the doorway to get out. And I spent another 7 years trying to figure that out. And again, I'm going to repeat myself a little bit. That's where I finally got down to the stage where I began to understand what poetry was all about. And I'm kind of passing that on to you in a very informal way. I have a couple of books out. You can get them on the webpage. One is Alice Hickey. The other is Soul Speak, The Outward Journey of the Soul. They'll put it down if you need everything in clip-clop order. Just go there and read them. They're for free. You can download them, But the important thing is you want to understand is that where poems come from is a mysterious thing, and why they arrive and how they come in the form they do, and why we can't force them to come is something that you have to understand. And also as to what their value is. Their value is it's the natural, okay, if you like nuts and berries and stuff, you want to listen to this. It's the natural way for the unconscious to communicate with the conscious mind, and for the conscious mind to communicate back to the unconscious. What does it give the unconscious? The unconscious comes up with a very complex feeling intelligence that when it hits the membrane of consciousness is translated into words and images. A story, really. It's not just words, And then when the human speaks them, it acquires the space and time. It becomes human. It lives in a world of time. And what the unconscious wants to feel, that feeling animal intelligence, which has really developed over the millennium now. It's not quite what it was when it first acquired. It's become more human, but it wants to get back those feelings. It wants to know what it's like to be human. Even though it lives next to consciousness, it has to live in its own world, and it's constantly trying to communicate with us. And the important thing to remember is that because it's a feeling intelligence that doesn't live in this world of time and space, bang, bang, that's time and space, is it rises up in our bodies. And God knows if it goes beyond our bodies, nobody can say yes and nobody can say no. It seems to know things beyond our body scope. It will rise up and it will press against the membrane of consciousness, and out of that will come images and words, the best fit. It's like you have a flame coming up. This is a thing that wants to come into time. It's a complex of feelings, and it hits the human membrane. It comes out as a story, and it seizes upon anything that the human consciousness can supply in the way of words and images and rhythms and everything like that. But it wants a match. The unconscious wants a match. It wants us to match. It wants us to layer it. It's as though you had a... Let me give you an image that might help you with some one of my books. So it doesn't take much thinking to really think it up. You've seen those kind of six-pointed, three-dimensional Mexican stars. They're made out of mirrors and little triangles. You know, it's something that Buckminster Fuller would make if he were Mexican, but somebody beat him to it a long time ago, some little tradesman. And you can, and if you kind of look at it, and you can see yourself, a little facet of yourself in the world, and it's really kind of three-dimensional. Think of the unconscious being a fiery ball that's changing shapes, and what the conscious mind does, as fast as it can, to match that shape, it just lays on all these little triangular mirrors all over the thing until it finally freezes it as best it can, that shape. It's always an approximation. It's always a metaphor, approximation for what those fiery forces were saying, you know? So each of those Mexican stars is unique. You can think of them as poems or stories. Stories are simply poems that arrive from the unconscious that have special characteristics, unbidden. We don't make them up. They make them up for us. People don't believe that. Sometimes who are poets, because they spend so much time screwing around with a poem after it comes to them to get a Nobel Prize. I don't know what they're after, or maybe just be good literature guys. But the fact of the matter is, I gave it up a long time ago. It's very nice. You can do some beautiful things, but the fact of the matter is, I'm more interested in that process, because what that is, it's the time that the unconscious and the conscious mate. That's why we have a little orgasm when that happens. It's a little scary, comes up, but it's also exhilarating. And there's always some amount of love in it. No matter how dark the poem, there's some amount of love in it. And that goes back to the mother goddess muse thing, which I keep kind of digressing from, but I wanted you to understand that's what happens. For example, I had a dream last night in which I was being attacked by Dennis Quaid, who I like as an actor. I don't know. And for some reason, he was a real son of a bitch. He was a real mean guy, you know. And I'm still trying to figure out as to why that was the closest thing in my consciousness to what my unconscious wanted to say to me. And I was fighting back, you know, which I usually get overwhelmed by these guys who attack me. But in this case, I was fighting back. I don't know how really good I was doing. But when I woke up, I said to myself, well, why Dennis Quaid? What's he to do? He doesn't play bad guys. He's generally the hero. You know, I always see him as a kind of hero in the movies. Well, why is that face the one that was the vicious face that wanted to get me and just attacking me, attacking me? As I have other people attack me who are really bad dudes, you know, I recognize them. What is he doing? There was something that I have to still figure out, because his face and name have something they're trying to tell me. It wasn't a good approximation. It was okay. That's a metaphor. He's a kind of metaphor for something, for some quaking maybe. I don't know what's happening. There's an earthquake. There's something. He's like an earthquake. You're coming to tell me something. I don't know. Maybe he's like my friend Dennis, you know, who in fact didn't come up. In fact, if it was about him, he would have come up. So I think it's just something about him, or it could be something that I spied in his character that is vicious. You know, I don't know. What you're left with is always a metaphor, and as to whether it's a prophecy or whether it's a poem, you have to let it come to you as a metaphor, and you have to reabsorb it, you know. And of course, the poem is successful if it finds a successful metaphor, Mexican silver star that traps the flame, the fiery flame at that instant, and you're able to look at the surfaces, which of course you show the world and yourself, and you absorb back the fiery flame, and you start to light up, you know. So that's really what is really going on in a poem all of the time. And I think that I was successful enough last week in trying to convince you that, as I'm convincing myself, by the way, these are things that I'm digging at as I go through my experiences that I went through in terms of the psychic experiences that happened to me. Because now I guess it's about 20 years ago. I don't know. Yeah. It's close to that. That are all chronicled in the book Alice Hickey. It's said to be a novel, but it's a fictionalized memoir of a 7-year period where I tried to unscramble both this long mythic poem and other psychic events that happened to me in conjunction with it, and just absolutely almost drove me out of my mind trying to figure out what was going on. And I was helped in that by a number of psychics, Alice Hickey and Jane Alexander and Diane Randall, and finally Alice Hickey came to take the final lid off the top and to tell me what it was all about. But one of the things that became clear through Alice, and eventually through, she kind of guided me into Graves, and for some reason, Julian Jaynes doesn't get into the mother goddess bit, just tangentially, you know, and Jung doesn't get into it either, although he declares that the mother to be the most powerful archetype there is. An archetype is something that will govern our feelings about mothers. We have our own individual mothers. We've known some mothers, but in back of that is this collective racial memory of mothers, probably going back to our animal mothers. And if it gets inflamed, there's a word for it, he calls it, or exaggerated, or it takes off, our sense of our mothers, or all mothers, could get overwhelmingly grotesque, scary. You know, they can possess us in a good way to be empowering, or they can possess us in the most horrible way to frighten us to death, because the mother goddess was both procreator, lover, destructress. As Graves said, she embodied all those forces. And what I tried to impart to you last week was that it had to be, why did the man become the first god? Why wasn't that internalized? Since the men were always stronger, you know, they were not weak in those days, you know, and back when they were hunting mammals and everything like that, mammoths, that the reason was that the male, let's say it's the first male human that has ever gone, he doesn't really nurture the next humans that come up the line. But of course the female does, because the female becomes the mother. And we'll pay attention to that baby. And the way you become human is you get mothered into it. You're told a story and you have to respond with a story. So the human mother would always be looking to see if you were paying attention. If you got it, if you weren't, you're an animal. She'd take care of you, you know. She'd take care of you, but she was looking for somebody who got it. And she would want to mate with one who got it. It might be her own sons, you know. You don't want to mate with an animal. She wanted to mate with somebody like her. You know, so you have an enchantress, you have the person who created you, and you had the person who, if you got out of line, don't forget, we're very dangerous animals when we became human. And we're dangerous enough as chimpanzees, we can see them hunt down a weaker chimpanzee. They decide to gang up on him and kill him. They're pretty vicious boys. And you get humans who can tell each other stories. You get something worse than chimps who somehow collectively decide to bash somebody's head in, you know. So she was the enforcer too. The fact that she had an almost lunar cycle to her menstruation and that she bled, unlike most animals who don't bleed at the end of their period, she just reinforced that power of enchantress, of creatress, of destructress, of the one who told you how the world was created, how you were created, who it told you stories, who created you and who would destroy you if you got out of line, and who would want to procreate with you. She was the boss, basically. You know, that's it. You know, and when you put that together with the fact of her period, not like chimpanzees being 35 to 45 days, but very close to the lunar cycle. You know, the lunar cycle is like 29 days, and it's 28 days it's pretty much in cycle with that. It's the beginning is the moon, it's very thin, then the moon goes full, the woman ovulates, she's ready to have sex, and then the moon dies and the woman starts to bleed, it's dying. It's just, you know, it's an overwhelming story that I'm sure that the first mothers would tell again and again about themselves, and that eventually would form stories that would be passed down from that first mother to the second mothers, and it was on and on and on when it came. How does it get internalized? It gets internalized because what happens is that as you tell stories, these were powerful stories, these first stories. Don't forget that we didn't have any words. We just had sounds, and we had a little mime which we're trying to make up. So they're very creative. You're talking about the desire to tell stories, but you reach back into memory, whatever it's there, it's so spare, and you make up a story. That story itself goes into memory for the first time. Not as a story. You'd be surprised how it goes back as little pieces of the story, but it's not quite like the animals' memory, which is just mostly kind of sensory. And what happens then is that you have this, the unconscious is feeling these stories. You don't care about the words. What it's feeling is the mother, creatress, destructress, blah, 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 blah. And I think what happens after a while and things like this, and don't forget that stories always exaggerate as they go. The only two things that remain constant are the name, mother. That's why it's always at least in the European languages, it's an M. Mama, mare, whatever, ocean, mama. And the theme, birth, death, procreation, whatever it happens to be. Everything else gets exaggerated. The Trojan horse gets bigger. There's not 500 Greeks, there's 5 million Greeks, there's 10,000 ships. They couldn't build that number of ships at 1,000. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the Trojan walls. We know now that Troy was very small, and, you know, you couldn't support that many men, but everything gets bigger, you know, it's tall tales. So there was no doubt that as the kind of image of the first mother as being big, huge, takes life, gives life, procreates, lover, you know, tells you everything, teaches you everything you know, that gets absorbed into the unconscious in some way. And when the unconscious, it is constantly at us. It wants to, from the very first, wants to come at us, and it's going to come at us in something that is like the mother goddess, or like the first mother. It became the mother goddess later, you know, whenever as men begin to give names to things. But what would come up from the unconscious was some reformulation of those stories that the first humans were telling each other. And what the human mind did, and the way it works in terms of the human part of us and the animal part of us, to try to find the best fit it could for what was being brought up by the unconscious. And I believe that it would bring up the kind of image, maybe exaggerated, of the first mother, and probably the voice would be feminine, although we don't know if those voices were as, in those days, okay, back 40,000 years ago, if the voices were as different as they are today between the male and female voices. It's hard to say. My own feeling about the voices is they're neutral. They're not a female voice for sure in terms of the muse's voice, nor in terms of my guiding voices. But they're not overly masculine, not banging away, you know, and they have a little bit different characteristic. The muse is much more gentle, much more a storyteller, wants to share something with you, okay, wants to share it, whereas the guiding voices want to guide you. Don't do this. You know, those are the guiding voices we hear, so they're two different kind of voices. But I think we can say what happened is that somehow those things that men were humans, you know, were speaking to each other in a little limited way, basically became internalized. Don't forget, everything becomes a memory after a while, and then those memories, that in fact the unconscious makes sense to them. It knows the feelings associated with that kind of mother. You know, it's the first time I got the human way of saying it, and it's going to bring it up, and out of it is going to come the best match of voice and the best match of image in the case when the voices take a visualization. And so out of that, eventually, you can see Achilles speaking to Athena and looking at Athena. She's there, and sees the robe and the gray-haired Athena and the gray-eyed Athena. He's seeing her, you know, in the mist around her, and hears her voice and speaks to her, and she speaks to him and tells him what to do and what not to do. That's after tens of thousands of years of evolution of those voices. And I should make it clear, when I talk about the gods, I'm not talking about what we would call an absolute god, or the what we could call is the unknowable. Our God is pretty knowable in the Western traditions. In fact, the Hebrews, they wanted to make sure that they understood God and that God understood them. And all the representations we have of the gods are completely knowable. There's Zeus or Athena, whatever it happens to be. And so with all of the pre-literate traditions, they start to multiply, because everything in the pre-literate world is many. It's not one. There's no unifying, explaining tradition. It's satisfied with many because art can handle many. Logic can't. It only wants one cause and it wants one effect. They can't handle that kind of multiplicity. So I think that we have to really think of that in fact, eventually over time, that the muse's voice, the storytelling voice, which in fact I believe was created later than the commanding voices that we heard. I think it was our animal consciousness. I'm going to keep calling that, so we won't call it the unconscious. Wanted to instruct us to do something, and it found the words, and they're metaphors, which made its directions very, very iffy. You know, sometimes you could kind of decipher them, and then sometimes you couldn't because it was trying to find a match. You know. But I think that in terms of the muse, or the muses is how they were originally described, as the gods were described even in the opening books of Genesis as Elohim, which is plural, you know, for gods. At least the Hebrews had to put that in because that's the way that it had been handed down. But they soon kind of focused on the one God, and we have that kind of deductive principle now in all of our thinking. But in terms of the muse, eventually, I think was a voice that was developed later, and that came, again, by the unconscious wanting to communicate with us in a way that the humans were attempting to communicate. For example, that I think if you hear the voices of the gods, and they tell you what to do, and the results are good, and they generally were good, you know, so that's why they listened to the gods, otherwise they wouldn't listen, you know. It knew something beyond logic. It had a stretch in time and space. Don't do that. Don't go there. You know, it's the repository eventually of all of our senses of what's good and bad, beautiful and true. You know, they all reside there. After a while, you can never define them, as Plato showed us. But I think that you have to really think of when men started to imitate the gods, because they heard the speaking was metaphoric and it was always rhythmic. That's the way it comes down in the whole tradition for prophetic guiding voices, right into the times of Alexander and beyond him, and Caesar, where they go to the various prophets and oracles, and these women, it would always be women, would go into trances. They would come up with these statements which you had to then decipher. It was never a sure thing. They were helpful, but you had to. But the little knife in the pudding was you had to make sure that you deciphered them as correctly as possible. When you hear those voices and they've guided you, and you want to praise the gods, and it makes sense just to praise them back, you would imitate those voices. But there'd be human voices, and there'd be voices of love or praise or appreciation, and they'd be rhythmic, because that's the way they heard the voices, and they're rhythmic, and that rhythm. And they go back, and what would happen after a while is those also would be internalized. And they would be absorbed into the mother goddess image, which by that time had probably become huge. And it was like an offshoot of the mother goddess, a little kind of central principle. It was the storytelling part of the mother goddess, the one who told you the stories. This is who I am. I made you. Everything that you know, I taught you. I gave birth to you. I can destroy you, and I will make love to you. So that's, a lot of stories. Whoa! And I control the earth and the moon and the plant growth, and it's just an overwhelming thing. So what happens is the muse then is then the initiator of stories back to the human, not as stories. You have more complex feelings now than in fact the first feelings, and what it will do is it will reinforce. They'll come up in the same metaphoric, rhythmic way, okay? And it will grab whatever animal sound and whatever mime that the human animal can create in order to bring that story forth. And eventually we're going to bring forth language, which is a whole thing in itself we have to talk about. We can create poems, and I might do for you one day or a story. There's one in the book Alasiki that's funny, where I tried to tell a story about my first sexual experience through sounds and through mime. It's called I Imitate a Chimpanzee, because that's all I had. But I can tell a story that I'm human. And there are ways to do that, but to tell more complex stories, eventually that you need words. And somewhere along the line, one of the humans broke through and named something. It wasn't just an animal sound anymore. It was name something, and the others agreed. And that's the mystery. How they agreed and why they agreed. There's lots of explanations for it, but I don't know if anybody ever gets to the bottom of it. I have my own ideas. But the words essentially then became more facets of the Mexican star, that the unconscious, when it wants to come up with its complex feelings now, which are much more complex than when we first became human, it can seize onto those words as well as gestures, okay, as well as sounds, crying, First poems they weren't just removed, I did this and I went, it was emotional. We did it. I saw one of them once. It was unbelievable. You're talking about if the moment of ecstasy, the moment of out of body, whatever you want to call it, where you become one with the universe, it shames us. What that early poetry does, if you can catch some of it, that's not a tourist trap imitation, from a pre-literate tribe. It's just, you just sense what's going on. I saw one once, and that was a healing ceremony as well, so there was that involved, but it was very powerful. So hopefully, maybe I've confused you or I haven't, but what I'm trying to say is that the muse grew out of the mother goddess, who essentially became internalized, just like all things do over time, and enlarged out of the first mother. These stories told about the first mother as time began to go. And it was the way that the unconscious spoke to us about the first mother. And it would come in terms of those voices that Jane says all pre-literate voices heard. They may come in the very beginning, just visions of the mother goddess in a sound, or it would come to as a kind of sound, mime kind of story that they would hear. But in fact, eventually over time, it would start to come as words as well. And we are the inheritors of that today. So with all that said, and if we'll give you some time to think about it, I'm going to sign out with the poem I originally wanted to play for you, and I hope it's not causing my problem here. Let's do it a little bit differently. It's done with some Spanish music from Mexico that I recorded from the hairdresser who lived next to me. Her name was Elvia Figueroa. Her voice was absolutely stunning. Locked in a little Mexican town. It has Adora doing the words on it, and Susie Wills doing an incredible dance that I recorded. I put all three pieces together one day, and then I just showed them to Adora, and she did the actual spoken poem, just bingo on the spot, and just glued the whole thing together. So here you go, and I'll see you next week.
Everywhere. I'm drowning in feeling like sometimes women do. Water. Holy water. Washes over me. So sweet. So cruel. So warm. So cold. Feel it lift you up. Float on your feelings like women do. Feel them wash over you. neighborhood you were born in.
Déjame encender la luz, no quiero nada.
Water.
Si hubiera sido ayer, lo tomaría.
Happiest
La primera
near
vez
the water.
para que yo aquí me quede, pero sin amarte ya
It is my
te
element
ganaría.
as much as air.
Que un día fue, no será. Ya no vuelvas a
I don't need much, just to see